Evelyn Carter, a 77-year-old widow, sits quietly in Maple Grove Diner, counting coins under the scornful gaze of manager Mark Stevens and giggling waitress Brittany. Mocked as a charity case, Evelyn endures public humiliation until a sleek black town car arrives. Her attorney, James Morrison, reveals her secret. She's the diner's majority owner. The room falls silent as Evelyn fires Mark, exposing his cruelty and the diner's decline. Her quiet strength sparks a transformation. But what changes will she demand next? And what secrets lie in the documents she carries? Share this video to inspire someone to stand up for respect. Comment respect below to join the movement. Your support helps us tell stories that prove kindness is true power. Thank you. The Maple Grove Diner hummed with the lively chaos of a Saturday morning. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of sizzling bacon and sweet maple syrup, mingling with the faint bitterness of freshly brewed coffee. Silverware clinked rhythmically against sturdy ceramic plates, and the low murmur of conversation filled the space with warmth. Truckers sat hunched over the counter, their weathered hands cradling steaming mugs, their faces etched with the exhaustion of long hauls but softened by the promise of a hearty meal. In the red vinyl booths, families laughed, their children's voices rising in a joyful cacophony as they smeared syrup across pancakes. College students, bleary-eyed from late-night studying or revelry, shared towering platters of golden pancakes, their chatter punctuated by bursts of laughter. The diner was a snapshot of small-town life, a place where strangers and regulars alike found solace in the familiar rhythm of a weekend breakfast. In a quiet corner booth by the window, Evelyn Carter sat alone, her presence almost swallowed by the bustling energy around her. At 77, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the casual din of the diner. Her silver hair, though thinning with age, was meticulously styled, each strand carefully tucked into place as if to preserve a memory of younger days. Her gray wool coat, worn but impeccably clean, draped over her frail frame, its frayed edges a testament to years of careful use. On the scratched formica table before her, she methodically counted out quarters and dimes from a small leather purse, her weathered hands moving with deliberate precision. Each coin was placed with care, as though the act itself held a deeper significance, a ritual of pride perhaps, or a quiet defiance against the world's assumptions. Around her neck hung a delicate chain, its emerald pendant catching the morning light in a way that hinted at a story untold, a piece of elegance that seemed at odds with her modest appearance. "Coffee and toast, please," Evelyn said softly when a young waitress approached, her voice carrying a refined cadence, as though she had once moved in circles far grander than this small-town diner. The waitress, barely out of her teens, glanced at the small pile of coins and gave an almost imperceptible roll of her eyes, a fleeting gesture that spoke volumes about her assumptions. Evelyn caught the look, and for a moment her fingers paused over her purse, her heart tightening with a familiar pang. She had felt eyes like these before, judging, dismissive, reducing her to a caricature of age and poverty. Yet she kept her gaze steady, her expression composed, though a faint flush crept into her pale cheeks, betraying the sting of being so casually overlooked. From behind the counter, Mark Stevens, the 28-year-old manager, watched the scene unfold with growing irritation. His perfectly styled hair and crisp uniform gave him an air of authority, but the sneer curling his lips revealed a man who thrived on control, particularly when it came at someone else's expense. "Hope you brought enough change this time, ma'am," he called out, his voice deliberately loud, slicing through the diner's hum and drawing every eye to Evelyn's corner. "Can't keep giving handouts to every sob story that walks in." The words landed like a slap, and the diner seemed to hold its breath for a moment before the whispers began. Nearby, a young waitress named Brittany stifled a giggle behind her order pad, her eyes glinting with amusement. "Maybe she'll pay in stories again," she muttered to a coworker, her voice dripping with mockery. "Tell us about the good old days." At a nearby table, a group of college students exchanged smirks, their phones already out, capturing the moment for their social media feeds. "Old people think they own the place," one of them whispered to his girlfriend, his tone sharp with condescension. "Someone should tell Grandma this isn't 1950. The words stung, though Evelyn gave no outward sign of hearing them. Her fingers tightened around her purse, the leather worn smooth by years of use, and she touched the emerald pendant at her throat, a small instinctive gesture, as though drawing strength from a cherished memory. The pendant was her anchor, a reminder of a life that had once been vibrant, filled with purpose and respect, now reduced to a spectacle for strangers' amusement. The truckers at the counter exchanged uneasy glances, their weathered faces betraying discomfort at the scene. They were no strangers to hardship themselves, and the sight of an elderly woman being publicly shamed stirred something in them. Empathy, perhaps, or guilt for their silence. But they said nothing, their eyes dropping to their coffee cups as if to distance themselves from the cruelty unfolding. A family with young children in a nearby booth avoided looking at Evelyn altogether, their laughter fading into awkward silence as they focused intently on their plates. Regular customers who had witnessed similar scenes before shook their heads with a mix of sympathy and resignation, but none spoke up. It was easier to stay out of it, to let the moment pass, to pretend they hadn't seen the quiet indignity being heaped upon a woman who deserved better. Evelyn's heart pounded, though her face remained a mask of composure. The whispers and stifled laughter rippled through the diner like a cold wind, each snicker a reminder of how the world often saw her. Not as a person with a lifetime of stories, but as a burden, a relic, someone to be pitied or mocked. Her fingers trembled slightly as she continued stacking her coins, arranging them in neat piles with a precision that belied the storm of emotions within her. She wanted to stand, to speak, to remind them all that she was more than the sum of her coins and her worn coat. But pride held her tongue, and instead, she let her actions speak, each coin a small act of defiance against their assumptions. Mark, emboldened by the attention, strutted closer to her table, his chest puffed out as if he were performing for the crowd. "Look, lady," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a business, not a charity. If you can't afford to eat here, maybe try the soup kitchen down the street." The college students erupted in snickers, their phones held higher, capturing every moment of Evelyn's humiliation. She didn't flinch, though her heart ached with a quiet fury. She had known hardship before, decades of it in fact, but to be reduced to this, to be made a spectacle in a place where she sought only a simple meal, cut deeper than she cared to admit. When she looked up, her eyes held a depth that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime, sorrow, resilience, and something else, something that flickered like a quiet flame. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Crystal clear. The words were soft but carried a weight that silenced the nearest tables, if only for a moment. There was a power in her gaze, a strength that hinted at a life far richer than anyone in the diner could imagine. She wasn't just an old woman counting coins. She was Evelyn Carter, a woman who had lived through wars, losses, and triumphs, who had loved deeply and fought fiercely for every scrap of dignity she still carried. Through the large front window, a sleek black town car glided to a stop at the curb, its polished surface gleaming in the morning sun. The driver, a distinguished man in a charcoal suit, stepped out with an air of purpose, his eyes scanning the diner's interior as he approached the entrance. His gaze locked onto Evelyn, and for the first time that morning, her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. The diner's chatter faded as heads turned, sensing that something was about to change. The driver's presence was a quiet command, a signal that the narrative was shifting. And Evelyn, with her emerald pendant and her unwavering dignity, was no longer just the frail woman in the corner booth. Evelyn Carter sat in the worn corner booth of Maple Grove Diner, her fingers methodically counting out coins from a small, faded cloth purse. Each penny, nickel, and dime clicked softly against the formica tabletop, a rhythm that seemed to irritate the restless hum of the diner. To the casual observer, she was just an elderly woman, perhaps lost in her own world, clinging to a modest order of coffee and toast. But Evelyn's sharp, weathered eyes missed nothing. Her heart, heavy with memories and purpose, pulsed with the weight of a lifetime's lessons, and a mission that was about to unfold before the unsuspecting staff and patrons of this small-town eatery. 60 years ago, Evelyn's story had begun on a crumbling farm just beyond the town's limits. Orphaned at 14, she'd faced a world that offered little mercy. With no family to lean on, she'd scrub dishes in diners much like this one, her hands growing rough and calloused as she worked through high school. Those early years taught her resilience, but they also carved a deep understanding of service. Not just the act of serving food, but the quiet dignity of serving others. She'd learned to put the needs of strangers before her own, a habit that lingered even as her life transformed. At 19, Evelyn met Robert Carter, a young civil engineer whose kind eyes and boundless ambition sparked something in her soul. Their love was immediate, fierce, and practical. Together, they built more than a marriage, they forged an empire. It started with a single diner renovation, a labor of love that blossomed into a chain of restaurants, then shopping centers, and eventually sprawling real estate developments across 3 states. Their success was staggering, but Evelyn never let it define her. She wore simple clothes, drove unassuming cars, and sought out small diners on every trip, believing they revealed the true heart of a community. "You can judge a place by how it treats its strangers," she'd often told Robert, her voice soft but resolute. He'd nod, his smile reflecting her wisdom, knowing she saw truths others overlooked. When Robert passed away 5 years ago, Evelyn's world dimmed, but her resolve sharpened. His death left her not only his fortune, but his philosophy. Judge a business by its humanity, not its balance sheet. She'd inherited his stake in dozens of small restaurants and diners across the region, including Maple Grove, becoming a silent but powerful shareholder. Yet she kept her wealth hidden, choosing instead to test the world's kindness, or lack thereof. In the 2 years since Robert's passing, she'd endured slights and humiliations, upscale restaurants refusing her service because of her plain appearance, salespeople dismissing her as too poor to matter, and younger generations seeing only a frail old woman rather than the astute businesswoman she was. Each rejection stung, but it also fueled her purpose. She carried Robert's lessons like a torch, illuminating the flaws in a world that had grown careless with its compassion. Maple Grove Diner held a special place in Evelyn's heart. It was here, decades ago, that she'd washed dishes as a teenager, her first step toward independence. It was here that Robert had proposed, sliding a modest ring across a table sticky with coffee and pie crumbs, his eyes brimming with a future they'd build together. And it was here, in this very booth, that they'd shared their last meal before his final hospital stay, their hands intertwined as they spoke of love and legacy. Now, as she sat in the same booth, the diner felt both familiar and foreign. The current staff's indifference was a stark contrast to the warmth she remembered, and her heart ached for what had been lost. For 3 months, she'd visited regularly, her small leather notebook hidden beneath her napkin, where she meticulously recorded every interaction. She noted the dirty rags left on counters, the unwashed hands of servers, the expired milk sitting unrefrigerated. She observed who received smiles and who was served with barely concealed disdain, her pen capturing the subtle hierarchies of appearance and status. Today, the diner buzzed with tension. Mark, the manager, loomed over her table, his voice sharp and impatient. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to either order something substantial or make room for paying customers." His tone dripped with condescension, as if her presence was an inconvenience to his bustling business. Evelyn's gaze lifted calmly, her voice steady but soft. "I did order," she said, gesturing to her untouched coffee and toast, the steam long gone from the chipped mug. Mark scoffed, folding his arms. "Yeah, well, this ain't a homeless shelter. People come here to eat, not to watch someone count pennies for an hour." His words cut, but Evelyn's expression remained serene, her fingers brushing the emerald pendant hanging at her neck, a gift from Robert, engraved with EC, my forever. It was her anchor, grounding her in the love they'd shared and the strength they'd built together. Behind the counter, Brittany, a young server, leaned lazily, smirking at the scene. "Maybe she's one of those extreme couponers," she said loud enough for the nearby patrons to hear. "You know how old people get about money." Her laugh was cruel, a casual jab that drew chuckles from a group of college students at a nearby table. They had their phones out now, cameras trained on Evelyn. "This is going straight to TikTok," one whispered, his voice tinged with amusement. "Poor grandma doesn't even know where she is." Their mockery stung, but Evelyn's heart didn't waver. She saw their laughter for what it was, ignorance, not malice, and her trained eye continued cataloging every detail. The health code violations, the uneven service, the way the staff's attitudes shifted based on who they thought mattered. In her purse, alongside the carefully counted coins, rested a thick manila envelope. Inside were ownership documents, stockholder certificates, and a letter from her attorney granting her full authority over management decisions. She'd carried these papers for months, waiting for the moment when the diner's true character would reveal itself. That moment was now. Mark's patience had evaporated, his voice rising as he leaned closer. "Listen, lady, I've got a business to run. Either order a real meal or get out." His words hung in the air, heavy with finality, as the diner's door chimed softly. A man in a charcoal suit stepped inside, his presence commanding yet understated. His eyes swept the room with professional calm, taking in the scene. Mark's aggressive stance, Brittany's smug grin, the students' phones, and Evelyn sitting quietly, her hands folded over her napkin. His gaze lingered on her, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Evelyn's heart steadied, her fingers tightening briefly around her pendant. The man's arrival marked the turning point she'd been waiting for, and the lesson she'd come to teach was about to begin. The air in Maple Grove Diner hung heavy with the weight of judgment, the clatter of cutlery and the hum of casual chatter, fading into a tense, anticipatory hush. Evelyn Carter sat alone in her corner booth, her frail fingers meticulously arranging a small pile of coins on the table before her. Each penny, nickel, and dime was placed with care, as though she were assembling a mosaic of her own resilience. Her face, lined with the passage of decades, betrayed no hint of the storm brewing within her heart. She had endured the sidelong glances, the whispered snickers, and the blatant condescension of those around her for nearly an hour now. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, a quiet fire smoldered, a fire fueled by the indignity of being dismissed, of being reduced to a caricature of frailty in the eyes of strangers. Mark Stevens, the diner's manager, stood a few feet away, his arms crossed and his lips curled into a smug grin. He had been watching Evelyn since she first shuffled through the door, her modest coat and worn handbag marking her, in his mind, as an easy target. To him, she was just another old woman, out of place in a world that valued speed and status over patience and dignity. His earlier remarks, sharp, mocking jabs about her slowness, her pocket change, had elicited laughter from the younger staff and a few patrons. Emboldened by their reactions, Mark felt invincible, his arrogance swelling with every chuckle. He didn't see Evelyn as a person. He saw her as a spectacle, a chance to assert his authority and entertain his audience. Deep down, though, a flicker of unease gnawed at him, a vague sense that he was playing a dangerous game, though he couldn't quite name why. Brittany, a young waitress with a nervous giggle, hovered nearby, clutching a coffee pot as if it were a shield. She had joined in the mockery earlier, her laughter more a reflex than a conviction. But now she felt the room's energy shift. Something was wrong, though she couldn't pinpoint what. Her eyes darted between Mark and Evelyn, her stomach twisting with a mix of guilt and confusion. She had assumed Evelyn was just a confused elderly woman, someone to be pitied or humored. Now, as the diner grew quieter, Brittany wondered if she had misread the situation entirely. Her fingers tightened around the coffee pot's handle, her unease growing with every second of silence. At a nearby table, a college student named Ethan held his phone aloft, the camera trained on Evelyn's weathered face. His girlfriend Mia leaned in close, stifling a laugh as she whispered, "This is going viral for sure." Ethan grinned, his thumb hovering over the record button, already imagining the likes and retweets. To him, Evelyn was content, pure, unfiltered drama. He didn't see the pain in her eyes or the quiet dignity in her posture. He saw only a moment to exploit, a chance to capture what he assumed would be her inevitable breakdown. "Old people always cry," he murmured, his voice laced with cruel anticipation. Mia nodded, her own excitement tinged with a faint pang of discomfort. She pushed it aside, focusing instead on the screen, where Evelyn's every move was being immortalized. Across the counter, a truck driver named Carl shifted uncomfortably on his stool. He had been watching the scene unfold, his weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm mug of coffee. Unlike the younger patrons, Carl saw something familiar in Evelyn's quiet endurance, a strength he recognized from his own mother, who had faced similar dismissals in her later years. His gut told him to speak up earlier, to call out Mark's cruelty, but he had hesitated, unsure if his voice would matter in a room full of mocking laughter. Now, as Mark's taunts grew sharper, Carl's resolve hardened. "Hey, maybe that's enough," he said, his voice low but firm. Mark whirled on him, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Mind your own business," he snapped, dismissing Carl with a wave of his hand. Carl's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue, his gaze shifting back to Evelyn. He sensed that something was about to change, though he couldn't predict what. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, decided it was time to deliver the final blow. He stepped closer to Evelyn's booth, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look, Grandma," he said loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull here, but this isn't a charity. We serve real customers with real money, not folks who think counting pennies makes them special." The words landed like a slap, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Brittany's giggle faltered, her eyes widening as she sensed the line Mark had just crossed. Ethan's camera zoomed in, his excitement peaking as he whispered, "Here it comes, she's gonna lose it." Mia leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. Even Carl tensed, his fingers tightening around his mug, ready to intervene if things went too far. Evelyn, however, remained still. Her hands paused over her coins, but her expression didn't waver. Inside, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the steely resolve that had been forged through decades of triumphs and trials. She had walked into this diner knowing what might happen, knowing how people often mistook her age and appearance for weakness. She had endured their scorn not because she had to, but because she chose to. Every snicker, every cruel word had been a test, not of her patience, but of theirs. And now, as Mark stood before her, basking in his imagined victory, Evelyn felt a quiet surge of power. The game, as she had always known it would, was about to shift. The diner's door swung open and James Morrison stepped inside. His presence was like a sudden gust of wind, commanding attention without effort. For 15 years, he had been Evelyn's attorney and business manager, a man who knew her not as the frail figure she appeared to be, but as a force of nature cloaked in humility. His steps were measured, deliberate, as he approached Evelyn's table. The room's chatter dwindled to a murmur, then to silence, as patrons and staff alike sensed a shift in the atmosphere. James's face was calm, his eyes sharp with purpose. But beneath his professional demeanor lay a fierce loyalty to the woman who had entrusted him with her legacy. He had seen Evelyn weather countless storms, and he knew that this moment, this public humiliation, was merely the prelude to a reckoning. "Mrs. Carter," James said, his voice clear and warm, tinged with the respect that seemed to fill the room. "I apologize for my delay. Are you ready to proceed?" His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. Evelyn looked up from her coins, and for the first time since entering the diner, a smile curved her lips. It wasn't the polite, strained smile she had worn to deflect the cruelty around her. This was something else, sharp, knowing, like the glint of a blade catching the light. It was the smile of a woman who had waited patiently for her moment, who had let the world underestimate her until the time was right. Inside, her heart swelled with a mix of relief and anticipation. James's arrival was the signal she had been waiting for, the turning point she had orchestrated with care. "Yes, James," she said, her voice rising with a sudden commanding strength that seemed to surprise even herself. "I believe I've seen quite enough." The words reverberated through the diner, each syllable laced with a quiet authority that made every head turn. Mark, caught off guard, stepped forward, his earlier arrogance giving way to confusion. "Excuse me, but you can't just—" he began, his voice faltering as James turned to face him. The attorney's expression remained neutral, but his tone carried an unmistakable edge. "And you are?" he asked, though the question was more a challenge than a query. "Mark Stevens. I'm the manager here," Mark replied, puffing out his chest in a last-ditch effort to reclaim control. James glanced at Evelyn, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod, her eyes gleaming with a mix of amusement and resolve. "I see," James said, his voice smooth but unyielding. "Well, Mr. Stevens, I think you're about to have a very interesting conversation with my client." The diner was now a sea of stunned silence, the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the kitchen muted as if the world itself were holding its breath. Every person who had laughed, jeered, or stood by while Evelyn was humiliated now waited, their eyes wide with a dawning sense of dread. James stepped forward again, his voice slicing through the tension. "Is this how Maple Grove Diner treats all its customers? Or just the ones who built this place?" he asked, his words sharp enough to draw blood. Someone. Mark's irritation flared, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are," he started, but James cut him off with the precision of a man who had spent years wielding words as weapons. "James Morrison, legal counsel for Carter and Associates," he said, producing a business card with a flourish that felt almost theatrical. "And this," he said, gesturing toward Evelyn, "is Mrs. Evelyn Carter, majority owner of this establishment." The silence that followed was absolute, a void so profound it seemed to swallow even the faint gurgle of the coffee maker. Mark's face froze, cycling through a kaleidoscope of emotions, confusion, disbelief, and finally a creeping horror as the truth sank in. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice barely audible. Evelyn rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. The trembling that had plagued her hands earlier was gone, replaced by a steady grace that spoke of a woman fully in control. When she spoke, her voice carried the room, resonating with the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she said, her gaze sweeping across the diner, taking in every face that had mocked her, every eye that now avoided hers. "My late husband, Robert, and I have owned controlling shares of Maple Grove Diner since 1977, when we purchased it from the founders. This place, this diner, it's our legacy, our life's work." Her words were measured, but they carried a quiet power, a force that seemed to decades of perseverance, of building something enduring in a world that often tore things down. Inside, her heart swelled, not with anger, but with a profound sense of vindication. She had let them see her as weak, let them believe their shallow assumptions, because she knew the truth would hit harder when it finally came. And now, as she stood there, surrounded by a room full of people who had underestimated her, Evelyn Carter felt truly seen. The air in the diner felt thick, charged with a quiet tension that seemed to pulse through every corner of the room. Evelyn Carter stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding yet understated, as she let the weight of her words settle over the stunned crowd. "This diner," she began, her voice steady but laced with a deep, resonant conviction, "was built by the Hendrickson family, my family. My husband Robert and I poured our hearts into making this place more than just a stop for coffee or a quick meal. We wanted it to be a sanctuary, a cornerstone where anyone, no matter their story or their struggles, could walk through those doors and feel seen, valued, and respected." Her gaze swept the room, lingering on the faces of truckers hunched over their plates, families with children now frozen mid-bite, and college students whose phones had momentarily stilled. She reached into her purse with deliberate care, pulling out a manila envelope that crinkled faintly in the hush that had fallen. From it, she extracted a stack of documents, their edges worn but official, and laid them out like a hand of cards. "These," she said, holding up the first set of papers, "are the ownership records, filed with the county clerk, proving this diner belongs to me. These," she continued, lifting another, "are the incorporation documents, naming Carter and Associates as the primary shareholder. And this," she said, her voice sharpening as she raised a crisp, formal letter, "is my authorization to make immediate decisions about staffing and operations." The words hit like a thunderclap. Mark Stevens, the diner's manager, stood rooted to the spot, his face draining of color until it resembled the chalky white of the countertop. His mouth twitched, but no words came. Around him, the diner buzzed with a low hum of murmurs. Customers who had been filming the earlier scene, expecting to capture some fleeting moment of drama, now turned their phones toward Evelyn, their lenses catching something far more profound than they'd anticipated. The air crackled with the weight of a moment that felt like it could reshape the very soul of the place. An older man, his hands gnarled from years of labor, rose slowly from his stool at the counter. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice rough but warm, "I remember you and Robert. You used to work the morning rush, didn't you? Right here." years ago. Evelyn's face softened, a genuine smile breaking through the steel of her resolve. That's right, Mr. Peterson, she replied, her eyes glinting with memory. She gestured to the booth where she'd been sitting moments before, its worn vinyl gleaming faintly under the diner's fluorescent lights. 48 years ago, right there, Robert got down on one knee over coffee and apple pie and asked me to marry him. The revelation rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. The truckers, who had watched the scene unfold in stoic silence, exchanged glances and nodded, their weathered faces softening with newfound respect. A family at a nearby table who had joined in the earlier whispers about Evelyn's modest appearance now looked down at their plates, their cheeks flushed with shame. The college students, their phones still raised, began to lower them, the weight of their actions dawning on them. They had been filming what they thought was a spectacle, only to realize they were documenting their own complicity in something cruel. Evelyn, they now understood, wasn't just a woman counting change at a booth. She was the heart of this place, someone who could likely buy their entire university and still have change left over. But Evelyn wasn't done. Her voice grew stronger, carrying the cadence of someone who had been silent for too long, but now had no intention of holding back. For the past 3 months, she said, her eyes scanning the room, I've been coming here, quietly observing. I've sat in these booths, ordered coffee, watched how this diner runs. And what I've seen has broken my heart. Health code violations that put customers at risk. Staff treating people with disdain based on how they look or what they can afford. And worst of all, she said, her gaze locking onto Mark with an intensity that made him flinch, a complete betrayal of the values this diner was built on. Mark opened his mouth, a stammered protest forming, but Evelyn raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that was both firm and graceful. Mr. Stevens, she said, her voice cutting through his attempt to speak, I've watched you mock elderly customers, turn away people you thought didn't belong, and foster an environment where cruelty is celebrated and kindness is mocked as weakness. That stops now. She turned to face the entire diner, her posture straightening as her words filled every corner of the room. This place was meant to be a haven, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and determination. A place where a truck driver could share a counter with a banker, where a young couple on their first date could feel as cherished as a family marking 50 years together. That spirit, that dream, has been suffocated under your management, Mr. Stevens. One of the college students, a young man with a phone still clutched in his hand, found his voice. Mrs. Carter, he said, his words halting. We didn't know, we're sorry. Evelyn's eyes softened, but her expression remained resolute. Sorry for what? She asked gently, her tone a challenge wrapped in compassion. For assuming someone counting coins couldn't possibly own this building? For thinking age and simple clothes mean helplessness? For joining in a public shaming because it was easier than showing a scrap of human decency? Her words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, forcing everyone in the room to confront their own assumptions. Then she turned back to Mark, her voice hardening into something unbreakable. Mr. Stevens, you're fired, effective immediately. Gather your things and leave my property. Mark's jaw worked soundlessly, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an ally. You can't just, he sputtered, but Evelyn cut him off with a calm, unshakable certainty. I absolutely can, she said, and I am. Security will escort you out if you make it necessary. From the sidelines, Brittany, a young waitress who had been part of the earlier scene, stepped forward, her face streaked with tears. Mrs. Carter, please, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean, I need this job. Evelyn studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She saw the raw remorse in Brittany's eyes, the trembling hands that betrayed her fear and regret. What you did was cruel, Brittany, Evelyn said, her tone firm but not unkind. But cruelty often stems from ignorance, not malice. You'll keep your job, but you'll attend sensitivity training, and you'll personally apologize to every customer you've wronged. Around the diner, a quiet transformation began to take root. Customers who had been quick to judge now exchanged glances, their expressions softening with reflection. The truckers resumed their meals, but their nods carried a new respect. The family with children began speaking in hushed tones, as if reevaluating their own actions. The college students, their phones now tucked away, sat in silence, grappling with the weight of Evelyn's words. In that moment, the diner felt alive again, not just a place for coffee and pie, but a space where dignity could be restored, where second chances could be earned, and where the values of kindness and respect could once again take root. Evelyn stood at the heart of it, her resolve unshaken, her vision for the diner's future burning brighter than ever. The air in Maple Grove Diner still carried the faint hum of that pivotal morning when everything shifted. Evelyn Carter, her frail facade now shed, stood at the heart of it all, her presence no longer trembling, but resolute. She had spent decades building an empire with her late husband, Robert, and the weight of that legacy pulsed through her veins as she faced the staff. The hunched shoulders that had once disguised her strength now squared with purpose, her hands steady as they gestured with quiet authority. Inside, Evelyn felt a storm of emotions, pride for what she and Robert had created, fury at the cruelty she'd endured, and a fierce determination to restore the diner's soul. Her voice, once soft as she counted coins to maintain her disguise, now carried the commanding cadence of a woman who refused to let her life's work be tarnished. The memory of Robert's gentle encouragement echoed in her mind, urging her to reclaim what they'd built together. Mark Stevens, the young manager who had ruled the diner with a dismissive sneer, was gone by noon, his cruelty exposed and his authority stripped. In his final moments at the diner, he stood silent, his usual arrogance replaced by a flicker of shame he couldn't quite hide. He had underestimated Evelyn, dismissing her as just another elderly customer, unaware of the power she wielded. As he walked out, the weight of his actions settled over him, a nagging realization that his callousness had cost him more than a crumb. It had unraveled his carefully crafted sense of control. Brittany, the young waitress who had joined in mocking Evelyn, felt her heart lurch when the truth came to light. The sting of guilt gnawed at her as she approached Evelyn's table, her hands trembling as she stammered out apologies. Her cheeks burned with shame, each word heavy with the regret of having laughed at someone she now knew deserved respect. Deep down, Brittany grappled with her own insecurities. She'd mocked Evelyn to fit in, to feel powerful in a job that often made her feel small. But now, faced with Evelyn's unwavering dignity, she felt exposed, her bravado crumbling. Determined to make amends, Brittany threw herself into redemption with a fervor that surprised even her. She spent her evenings visiting elderly customers she'd once belittled, delivering handwritten apologies and meal vouchers, each gesture a step toward rebuilding her own sense of worth. Within 2 months, her genuine remorse and tireless effort earned her a promotion to shift supervisor, a role she embraced with a newfound sense of responsibility. She carried the weight of her past mistakes, but also a quiet pride in proving she could change. The truck driver who had tried to intervene during the mockery stood from his table, his weathered hands beginning a slow clap that spread through the diner like a wave. His heart swelled with quiet vindication. He'd seen the injustice in how Evelyn was treated and had spoken up, though his voice had been drowned out at first. Now, as the room joined him, he felt a rare sense of connection, a belief that decency could still prevail. The applause wasn't just for Evelyn, it was for the idea that respect could be reclaimed, that a single moment could shift a community's heart. Word of the morning's events raced through the small town, spreading faster than the summer wildfires that sometimes swept the nearby hills. By afternoon, Maple Grove Diner was alive with more customers than it had seen in months. They came not just for the familiar comfort of coffee and pie, but to witness a transformation unfolding before their eyes. Evelyn wasted no time. Her mind, sharp and strategic, churned with plans to restore the diner's legacy. She introduced a staff retraining program, bringing in sensitivity trainers from the city to instill lessons of dignity and respect. New protocols were set. Every customer, no matter their appearance, age, or means, was to be treated as family. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination became the diner's backbone, and Evelyn enforced it with the same resolve that had built her empire. She felt Robert's presence in every decision. His voice whispering at kindness was the true foundation of their success. On the diner's wall, a large, elegantly scripted mission statement appeared. Kindness served daily, where every guest is family. Below it hung a photograph from 1907, capturing a young Evelyn and Robert Art on their wedding day, their hands intertwined as they cut the ribbon at Maple Grove's grand reopening under their ownership. Evelyn's heart ached as she looked at it, the memory of Robert's laughter mingling with the pride of what they'd achieved together. The photograph was more than nostalgia. It was a reminder of the values they'd built the diner on, values she was now fighting to restore. Evelyn's most profound change was the weekly community breakfast program. Every Sunday, she personally funded free meals for seniors, veterans, struggling families, and anyone who needed a warm plate and a kind word. The program became a beacon, drawing volunteers from across the county, former customers who had witnessed the morning's events and wanted to be part of something greater. Evelyn felt a quiet joy watching the diner fill with laughter and gratitude each Sunday, knowing she was honoring Robert's dream of a place where everyone belonged. For her, it wasn't just about feeding people, it was about rebuilding a community fractured by indifference. The ripple effects reached far beyond the diner's walls. Local businesses, inspired by Evelyn's stand, began scrutinizing their own practices, questioning whether they truly valued every customer. College students who had filmed the initial humiliation, their laughter once echoing through the diner, created a viral video titled "When We Got Schooled" by a 77-year-old CEO. The video, raw and honest, garnered millions of views, sparking conversations about ageism across social media. The students, humbled by their own role in the incident, poured their regret into the project, hoping to turn their mistake into a lesson for others. Their voices trembled as they recorded, each frame a step toward accountability. 3 weeks later, an elderly, homeless veteran named Frank stepped cautiously into the diner. Years of rejection had etched wariness into his lined face, but whispers of the diner's new policies had reached him. His heart raced with a mix of hope and fear as he sat down, expecting the familiar sting of dismissal. Instead, Brittany greeted him with a genuine smile, her voice warm as she asked, "Good morning, sir. What can I get started for you today?" Frank's eyes welled up, his throat tight with emotion. "I heard things changed here," he managed to say, his voice rough from disuse. "They did," Brittany replied softly, her own heart swelling with pride. "Mrs. Carter made sure of that. You're welcome here. Always." For Frank, those words were a lifeline, a reminder that he wasn't invisible. When he couldn't pay for his meal, Evelyn appeared at his table with a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. "This one's on the house," she said, her voice steady but kind. "And every Sunday, if you'd like to join us." Frank's hands shook as he took the plate, gratitude overwhelming him. He became a regular, eventually volunteering at the community breakfasts, his story, shared with his permission, becoming a cornerstone of the diner's new identity. To Frank, the diner wasn't just a place to eat. It was a home where second chances were celebrated. Behind the main counter, Evelyn's emerald pendant, once her secret source of strength, now hung in a place of honor beside Robert's wedding photograph. A small plaque read, "This house was built on kindness." For Evelyn, the pendant was a talisman of resilience, a reminder of the quiet power she'd always carried, even when disguised as a frail customer. Each morning as she passed it, she felt Robert's presence, his belief in her fueling her resolve. The diner had become more than a business. It was a testament to the idea that kindness could rebuild what cruelty had torn apart. In the heart of a small town, the Maple Grove Diner had undergone a profound metamorphosis, blossoming into a beacon of hope and humanity under Evelyn's steadfast vision. Where once the air had been thick with indifference and casual disdain, now it hummed with warmth, laughter, and the clinking of coffee mugs shared among strangers who felt like kin. Evelyn, a woman whose quiet strength had ignited this change, believed fiercely that every soul who crossed the diner's threshold deserved to be seen, valued, and treated with unwavering dignity. Her philosophy had taken root, transforming not just the diner but the lives it touched, rippling outward in ways she could scarcely have imagined. Letters began arriving, first in a trickle, then in a flood, from every corner of the state and beyond. Each envelope carried stories of personal triumphs, of prejudice confronted and overcome through acts of courage inspired by the diner's rebirth. A young man from a nearby city wrote of how he'd found the nerve to challenge his co-workers' cruel jokes after reading about Evelyn's stand. A mother from a rural town shared how her son, once ostracized, now walked taller, knowing a place like Maple Grove existed. These letters weren't just praise. They were proof that Evelyn's resolve had sparked a quiet revolution, one heart at a time. For Evelyn, reading them late at night in the diner's back office, each story felt like a stitch in a tapestry of healing she hadn't known she was weaving. The diner's transformation drew a new crowd, one that craved more than just its famous blueberry pancakes. Families piled into minivans, driving hours from neighboring towns to sit in booths where they knew they'd be welcomed, no matter their story or status. They came for the promise of a place where everyone mattered, where a weary traveler or a single parent scraping by could find not just a meal, but a moment of belonging. Business didn't just grow, it soared. Within months, revenue had doubled, then tripled, as word of the diner's ethos spread. The staff, once plagued by turnover, now stayed, bound by a shared pride in what they'd built together. Waitresses like Brittany, who'd once rolled her eyes at problem customers, now greeted each table with a genuine smile, her heart softened by the change she'd witnessed. Even the cooks, like gruff old Frank, a veteran with a guarded heart, found themselves lingering after shifts to swap stories with regulars, their laughter echoing through the once tense kitchen. The diner's atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Where once sneers and whispered judgments had been the norm, now there was an unspoken pact of kindness. Strangers struck up conversations over steaming plates of eggs and hash browns, sharing snippets of their lives with an ease that felt almost sacred. For Evelyn, watching this unfold was like seeing a long-buried dream come to life. She'd spent years swallowing her pride in that corner booth, counting coins under the weight of mocking stares, her fingers trembling not from shame but from the quiet resolve to endure. Now, as she moved through the diner, her steps were lighter, her eyes brighter, as if the love she'd poured into this place had begun to flow back into her. As autumn painted the town in shades of amber and crimson, the county bestowed an extraordinary honor on Maple Grove Diner. It was chosen as the official venue for the National Kindness Day celebration. The news sent a thrill through the staff, who saw it not just as recognition, but as a chance to share their story with the world. For Evelyn, though, the honor carried a deeper weight. It was a validation of every tear she'd shed, every moment she'd chosen grace over bitterness. The event promised national media attention, a spotlight on the diner and its remarkable owner, but Evelyn's heart remained fixed on her community. The people who'd walked this journey with her, who dared to believe that cruelty wasn't inevitable. 6 months after that fateful Saturday morning, when a single act of defiance had set this chain of events in motion, Maple Grove Diner was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a living testament to reclaimed dignity, a sanctuary where broken spirits could mend over a warm meal and a kind word. On the morning of National Kindness Day, Evelyn stood before a vibrant crowd that spilled out from the diner's doors into the crisp autumn air. Local residents mingled with business owners, their faces alight with pride, while visiting dignitaries in sharp suits stood shoulder to shoulder with farmers in worn overalls. News crews from 3 states buzzed around, their cameras capturing the sea of diverse faces. But Evelyn's gaze lingered on her people, the ones who'd laughed, created, and grown alongside her. Her voice, steady and clear, cut through the hum of the packed diner as she began to speak. 6 months ago, I sat in that corner booth, counting change while people laughed. They saw an old woman, poor and powerless, and thought that was all I was. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the memory of that day's sting. But I need you to hear this. I wasn't the only one diminished that day. We all were. She swept her hand toward the crowd, her eyes meeting theirs, young and old, rich and struggling, now bound by a unity that had seemed impossible half a year ago. When we let cruelty become ordinary, when we dress up prejudice as common sense, when we judge someone by their clothes or their wallet instead of their heart, we rob ourselves of something precious. That day, we all learned a truth we can't unlearn. You never know who's sitting beside you. And more than that, it shouldn't matter. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the diner's walls. Brittany, now wearing a supervisor's badge pinned proudly to her uniform, brushed tears from her cheeks, her heart swelling with gratitude for the woman who'd shown her a better way. Frank, seated at his usual table, nodded quietly, his weathered face softened by a rare smile. He'd become the soul of the Sunday breakfast program, serving plates of pancakes to anyone who showed up, no questions asked, and in doing so, he'd found a purpose that had eluded him for years. Evelyn continued, her voice warm but resolute. This diner has received hundreds of letters from people whose lives have changed because of what happened here. A teenager in Arizona found the courage to stand up to bullies after seeing our story online. A business owner in Maine rewrote their hiring rules after learning about our second chance philosophy. A grandmother in Texas started her own community breakfast program, feeding folks who had forgotten what kindness tastes like. She paused, her hand brushing the empty space at her throat where her emerald pendant once hung. That pendant, now framed and mounted near the diner's entrance, gleamed softly in the morning light. A reminder that the most valuable things often wear the humblest disguises. The lesson isn't that respect comes from money or power. The lesson is that respect is what we owe every person, no matter where they're at in life. Because one day you might be the one counting change. You might be the one needing a second chance. You might be the one praying someone sees your worth when the world only sees your flaws. A hush fell over the room, her words sinking deep into every heart. Evelyn's gaze swept across the diner, taking in the walls adorned with the thank you letters, their edges curling from the weight of gratitude. Photographs of community events, potlucks, coat drives, children's art contests lined the counters, each one a snapshot of a town reborn. Today, hundreds of diners across this country are adopting kindness-first policies because of what we started here, she said, her voice rising with quiet pride. Thousands of people have shared stories of standing up for someone instead of standing by. Millions have been reminded that dignity, even the quiet kind, carries a strength that can change the world. For Evelyn, this moment was more than a celebration. It was a promise kept, not just to herself but to everyone who'd ever felt unseen. As she stepped back from the microphone, the crowd surged forward, their applause mingling with shouts of gratitude. In that instant, Maple Grove Diner wasn't just a building, it was a living, breathing movement, proof that one person's refusal to accept cruelty as normal could spark a fire that warmed countless lives. And for Evelyn, whose heart had always known the power of kindness, that was enough. The air buzzed with a quiet electricity as the crowd poured out into the evening, their hearts still thrumming from the words they just heard. The event had drawn people from every corner of the region, not just for the meal shared under the soft glow of string lights, but for something deeper, a collective yearning to witness the kind of change that begins with a single, defiant act of compassion. Cars stretched down the street, parked bumper to bumper for blocks, a testament to the pull of a story that had woven itself into the fabric of their community. Inside, the echoes of a 5-minute standing ovation still lingered, a roaring tribute to the power of ordinary people daring to reshape the world. Among the dispersing crowd, a young journalist named Clara wove her way through the sea of faces, her notebook clutched tightly, her mind racing with the weight of what she'd just witnessed. She was new to this beat, her enthusiasm for storytelling tempered by a lingering doubt about whether words could truly capture the raw, transformative energy of moments like these. She spotted Evelyn Carter standing near the edge of the gathering, her posture calm yet commanding, a woman whose quiet strength seemed to hold the entire evening together. Clara's heart quickened as she approached, determined to ask one final question that might distill the essence of the night. Evelyn, now in her late 60s, stood with a serene dignity that belied the years of struggle etched into her memory. Her eyes, bright and unwavering, carried the weight of a life shaped by both hardship and triumph. Decades ago, she had faced a morning that could have broken her, a moment of public humiliation that had left her trembling with anger and shame. She could still recall the sting of those mocking words, the way they'd tried to shrink her into something less than human. But even then, in the raw vulnerability of that moment, Evelyn had found a spark of resolve. She had refused to let cruelty define her. Instead, she chose to meet it with a quiet, unshakable respect for herself and for the world she believed could be better. That choice, made in the crucible of pain, had set her on a path that led to this night, where hundreds had gathered to celebrate the ripple effects of her courage. As Clara approached, Evelyn's lips curved into a gentle smile, the kind that seemed to invite trust and understanding without effort. The journalist hesitated, suddenly aware of the enormity of the story she was trying to capture. Evelyn's presence felt like a bridge between past and present, a living testament to the idea that kindness could be a radical act. Clara's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. Mrs. Carter, what do you hope people take away from your story? What do you want them to remember most? Evelyn paused, her gaze drifting briefly to the horizon, as if sifting through the years for the right words. The crowd's energy still hummed around her, but in that moment, she was alone with her thoughts, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the countless small acts of kindness that had sustained her. The stranger who had offered a smile when she felt invisible. The neighbor who had listened when her heart was heavy. The community that had rallied around her when she dared to stand tall. Each act had been a thread in the tapestry of her resilience, proof that respect and compassion could outlast any attempt to diminish them. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, imbued with a quiet conviction that seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone within earshot. I want people to remember that respect is timeless, she said. It's not something that fades with age or circumstance. It's a choice you make every day, no matter how the world tries to pull you down. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone make you feel small. That's where change begins, not in grand gestures, but in the stubborn, beautiful decision to hold on to your dignity and extend it to others. Clara scribbled furiously, her heart swelling with the weight of Evelyn's words. She felt a pang of awe mixed with a quiet resolve of her own. As a journalist, she often chased stories that felt fleeting, but this one was different. It was a reminder that every act of kindness, every refusal to bow to cruelty, could send ripples far beyond the moment. Evelyn's story wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been touched by her courage, who had seen in her a reflection of their own potential to create change. As the crowd continued to thin, the night air grew cooler, and the string lights cast a soft glow over the emptying street. Evelyn stood a moment longer, watching as people carried her story away with them, into their own lives and communities. She felt a quiet pride, not for herself, but for the idea that her refusal to be diminished had inspired others to do the same. It was a legacy not of wealth or fame, but of something far greater. The enduring power of respect, wielded with grace and unwavering resolve.